In the name of the one God, Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. Amen. I really love sometimes preaching during the summer months because there's such great juicy stories usually in the summer months, including our story this morning that we read, of course, of Jacob or of Joseph and the coat of many colors. Of course, we've lost that in the text. You'll notice it's now the ornamented coat. Ta-da. I was going to preach on that text this morning. And as I thought about it, the text really is a text about dysfunctional families. And I figured that was getting into meddling rather than preaching. So I shied away from that. But our gospel text is an equally familiar text to most of us, at least to most of us who've grown up going to church school and looking at those flannel board figures in our church school classes. I remember very vividly the poor teacher that my class tortured every year, teaching us these wonderful stories of Jesus on the boat. And it made me start thinking about what this story is all about. And my first thought was, how do you feel, or how have you felt when you have had to do something for the first time? Taken up a challenge, done something that you didn't think you could do. I'm thinking, of course, of my first solo car driving experience, or my first solo anything kind of experience, water skiing or rock climbing or performing of any kind. You remember that white-hot fear that comes over you? That kind of knee-knocking, stammering kind of fear of not being able to do it? You don't think you're going to make it? Remember those feelings? Well, I want us to think about those feelings today as we look into this gospel, because today's gospel text is about fear and terror. The larger scene of our gospel text is a lot more intense than we usually like to think about it. This larger context of this story where we find Jesus walking on the water is that Jesus and his disciples have just finished presiding over the feeding of a volatile crowd of thousands of men, women, and children who had mobbed Jesus during that day in Galilee. They had come to see who this troublemaker was, who was responsible for the killing of their friend and teacher, John the Baptist. And everybody wanted to know who this other teacher was, because it was rumored that this guy, Jesus, was in fact the resurrected John the Baptist. And they wanted to come and see the phenomenon. Well, whatever was happening, and we're not quite sure exactly what was going on in that text, but whatever was happening, what seems very clear is that Jesus needed to get those hapless disciples out of the area. And he wanted to calm and dismiss the crowds. Now, we're not sure what that exactly means, except that it possibly might mean that it was dangerous. That in fact, Jesus was concerned about the safety of his disciples, and likewise, the disciples were probably concerned about his own safety, wondering whether this crowd was going to kill him. At any rate, what we do know is Jesus commands the disciples to get into this fishing rowboat and sends them off onto the Sea of Galilee, away from the crowds. And it's nighttime. Now remember, these are times before electricity. It's pitch dark. And the hard wind is blowing, and if you've ever seen the Sea of Galilee when there's a hard wind blowing off the Mediterranean Ocean, it can be very rough. There can be whitecaps on that sea. Very rough indeed out there. Scary if you're in a little boat. And remember also that for all the people of this world, the sea was a place of demons. The sea was a place of monsters, of dark night forces that struggle against creation. In short, Jesus was sending these disciples of his out on a terrifying mission alone. Confused and awestruck perhaps over the day's events, these poor disciples perhaps worried that the mobs were going to kill his master. Nevertheless, the disciples obeyed Jesus and began to row out into the middle of this lake, far from the safety of the shore. And the text says they fought against the wind and the waves all night. No Jesus. All alone. I'm sorry, but this is a little bit more intense than your typical mild-mannered Sunday school telling of the story, isn't it? We all know what happens next. How the disciples see Jesus coming toward them, and in terror they believe that he's a ghost, and they start screaming and yelling. And then we have our favorite ne'er-do-well Peter, who says, "Let me come out and see you, if it's really you, Jesus." And Jesus tells Peter to come on out, and in true Petrine fashion, he strides out onto the water until he realizes what the heck he's doing. And then, bloop, he's in the drink. It's actually a very funny story if you look at it. I mean, think about it and visualize it. It's kind of a Monty Python type story, isn't it? Well, what do we make of this strange passage? Well, I know that all of us, as many of those flannel board lessons as we saw when we were kids, we've also heard 100 or more sermons on Peter's failure of faith and the failure to keep his focus, and that's why he sank. And so I'm not going to bore you with another sermon like that. Because what struck me about this larger lesson is that these disciples had to head out onto a sea at night by themselves. Jesus sends them out alone. And it struck me that for those of us ragtag disciples of our own church communities, those of us who strive to be disciples, we might feel very much the same way as those disciples did as they pushed off from the safety of the land into the darkness, not really knowing where they were going, just being told by their master, "Go!" Yet, throughout the Gospels, go is what Jesus tells us to do. Remember that other instance where Jesus sends the disciples out in pairs to preach and to teach and to heal? Or perhaps we've already forgotten that in this very passage that we're looking at, that we just got told about, Jesus and his disciples have just fed a huge mob of people, where Jesus says, "Take what you have and go and feed them." A few fish and some bread to feed an overwhelming and aggravated crowd of hungry people. No way, Jesus! How can we do that? We don't have what it takes. We don't have those resources. We don't have the food. Where's the food going to come from? The crowd's going to kill us. We'll never survive. You can hear him saying it, can't you? Yet I would suggest to all of us who claim to be Jesus' disciples that this is precisely what being a disciple is really all about. We're always being sent out to the margins of reality, always being sent out into the unknown, always being sent out into places and situations where we are called to be God's loving hand of healing and wholeness. We're always being called to go forth into the darkness of an unknown future, with little more at hand than a few fish and a couple of loaves of bread and our leaky little boats and our ragtag fellow disciples, and not nearly enough to get the job done. This is what Jesus commands us to do. Never mind, Jesus says, just go. Just do it. The work that we have in front of us is indeed daunting, and Jesus just says, go do it. Now, some of you might be well thinking, I wouldn't have gotten into that boat. I'm not equipped for that sort of work. I'm not good enough. I certainly am not smart enough. I don't have the energy. I'm getting too old for this. I'm sure all of us in this congregation have heard other members of the congregation say things like, let the next generation do it. Let them pick it up. Our congregation, our generation, we've done our job. No, we can't build anything new. No, we're beyond that now. No, we can't take care of all of those homeless people. That's way beyond our work. They'll destroy our buildings. They'll wreck our congregation. Why, we barely got the resources. We barely got the money to keep what we've got going. We don't have the budget. Mission? What mission? Let's just keep singing our favorite hymns and enjoy our congenial coffee hours. Let someone else do it. Ever heard anybody say things like that? No, we're not alone. You see, the disciples have been saying this since the beginning. Okay, we're no different than they are. Indeed, it seems that many of our fellow Christians seem to think that they're very much happier sitting in their beach chairs of their faith communities and sipping a cold one and letting the world go by. Sure, we'll stop at our friendly church for a little refreshment and reassurance and then be on our way. The world, its pain, its suffering, its hunger, its loneliness, the call, the mission, well, they're just beyond us now. We're not getting into any boat. Is Jesus nuts? We're not going anywhere. Well, my friends, my fellow disciples, what we need to hear today is that Jesus is calling us to get up off our beach chairs and to launch out into the darkness of the world that God has given us. We're needing to hear once again Jesus' commandments that we use what we have been given to clothe, to heal, and to make the world whole. God has given all that we need and all that we can want. We're not in charge of the whole business. That's too big. But that doesn't allow us to turn away from what God has placed right in front of us, right here and now. And that's overwhelming enough. You know, as laughable as Peter is in this story, maybe, just maybe, maybe we've got something to learn from him. Because at least, as much of a fool as Peter made of himself, he at least got out of the boat. He at least took the risk. We have in our day the question before us, Have we become deaf to Jesus' call? Have we become too tired and weary? Have we become too cynical and jaded? Have we become too fat and happy with the blessings that God has heaped upon us? You know something? There never will be another generation than us. We are all that there is. There are no others to hear and respond if we do not take heart and respond. Yes, I know that we may not be up to it. Yes, I know we're getting old. I'm certainly getting old. But the call of Jesus is to go where he tells us and go again and again and again. And it comes to us again today. Can we hear it? That is the question that this text asks of us. And you know what? We're promised that who we are and what we've got, those little loaves of bread, those few fish, and that leaky boat, are indeed going to be enough. And we're not alone. Jesus is with us. He's calling us to step out. And the question is, how will we answer?